Welcome everyone. My name's Jo Sheppard. I'm the CEO of the Queensland Farmers Federation, and it is our great pleasure to have you all joining us today for a very important discussion with Terry McCosker. How can we increase farm production and achieve environmental outcomes, and why does it matter? Really interesting discussion coming up, but before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the land on which we all gather here today, pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to let you know that we are recording the session so that we are able to share it with yourselves and also with other interested parties after today's discussion. Just quickly, a little bit about the Queensland Farmers Federation. So QFF is the peak representative body for agriculture in Queensland. Our members are peak bodies across the ag sector, including the likes of Cotton Australia, Cane Growers, Growcom, East Oz Milk, Nursery and Gardens in Queensland and the like. We actually have 20 peak bodies who are our members, and collectively we represent over 13,000 farmers across Queensland. Our role, of course, is to work across our membership and advocate and lobby on behalf of issues and challenges that are common for all of our members. One of the things, and while we're having this discussion with Terry today, is that farmers across Queensland are really trying to navigate through the opportunities and challenges in relation to carbon markets, biodiversity, other environmental markets, and the environmental markets piece more generally. But I think ultimately for most farmers, they're really trying to navigate the space, but position their businesses to be able to increase productivity and achieve strong environmental outcomes, which of course in turn will lead to creating a stronger future for regional communities, which is of course something that we're all very passionate about. From my perspective, this is the challenge. How do we achieve the ability to produce more of the world's finest food, fibre and foliage, whilst at the same time building strong, healthy, sustainable landscapes and vibrant regional communities? I think we need to be striving collectively to achieve all three, and I don't think that we can achieve one without the other. I think if we are achieving one without the other, we're actually not succeeding. And this is what I'm going to pick Terry's brain about in our discussion today. So I'm very much looking forward to that opportunity. I think QFF has a role in helping our members best navigate so that farmers are able to make well-informed business decisions for themselves, for their business, but also for their communities. QFF is really proud to be partnering with RCS Australia. The expertise and the knowledge that sits within that organisation collectively with all of the individuals who have been involved in this space for up to, over 3 decades is really, really valuable to us. The opportunity to support our members with information to successfully navigate this natural capital environmental space is very much appreciated. We are grateful, Terry, to have RCS as part of our corporate partnerships initiative. Wonderful to have you here this morning. Without further ado, you do have there is a bio on you, which is very, very long and very esteemed, which I'm going to skip this morning because I think for those of us on the call today, you really do need no introduction. Terry McCosker is the founding director of RCS Australia and has been working in this space for many decades and is very passionate about I guess taking what you've learned, Terry, and helping us apply it as an ag sector into the future. So we might get started. A big welcome, Terry. But just initially, I thought it might be useful for you just to share a bit of your journey, your personal journey, but also the journey of RCS, what you've learned along the way, and how you think what you've learned is framing your thinking for the opportunities and the challenges ahead. So over to you.
Thank you, Jo, and welcome everybody, and thank you to QFF for the opportunity to have a yarn today, and also for the opportunity for RCS to be a partner with QFF. So I guess my journey began a very long time ago now, more than 10 years ago, born into agriculture, and spent 12 years with Queensland DPI, and then I spent another 12 years up in the Northern Territory, mostly on a cattle property there. And since then, we've actually started RCS in 1985. and started I guess what you'd call the regenerative journey of RCS. Well, that wasn't called that back in 1989. And I think probably in 1989, 1990, we started teaching graziers in particular about ecology, and I've seen it in the last well over 30 years now, that when people become aware of the fact that they're farming an ecosystem instead of farming a commodity or just farming dirt or soil, their attitude to the environment actually changes. They start looking at things quite differently, and I found that over that time, it's the ecological understanding of how we interact with the ecosystem has probably been the greatest turn on for most farmers that I know. They really like to get that understanding, and so that's informed what we've done ever since. Although we really work with 4 key pillars. So that is the land and the ecosystem, the production system. So we've still got to produce food, we've still got to make a living in agriculture, and the business itself. So we've got to make a profit, and then the people. So there's 4 key elements, I think, in agriculture, and all of those have got to be balanced, and all of those have got to be regenerating. I think, to me, regenerative agriculture is a lot more than just agriculture itself. It's about, as you mentioned, communities, and it's also about regenerating profitability and people's health and well-being. So, yeah, I think, yes, that original rooting in ecology has really informed what we do and have done for a very long time.
That's great. Thank you, Terry. And those 4 pillars to me make complete sense. And just focusing on the people pillar, for a minute, are you seeing, as you said, farmers have for a long time realised the important link between soil health and the health of their landscape in terms of maintaining their productivity as a business. But what are you seeing in terms of, the people piece? Are farmers seeing opportunities in the environmental spaces? Are they seeing threats, or are they seeing both? Are they, informed and, ready to take on the challenges and the opportunities, or are we still a little bit like deers in the headlight?
Absolutely like deers in the headlight. I think at the moment there's a massive amount of confusion. The carbon space itself, which is part of natural capital, is starting to progress now. There's massive interest around the country in doing soil carbon projects, and I wear a couple of hats. One is Carbon Link, which is spun out from RCS many years ago, and there we will actually be creating the first carbon credits at scale in a commercial sense from about 18,000 hectares over the next few months, and the first of those hopefully will be issued in March or April. So that's progressing, and I think certainly in the grazing industry, what that's shown is that the income from carbon has significantly exceeded the income from livestock production. That's net of each. So I think that there are opportunities, but having had discussions with some of your member organisations over the last few months, it's quite obvious that there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of perception around threats. But I think that agriculture's got to get on the front foot here. If we sit back and just let this stuff roll on, and it's coming from 2 sources at the moment. There's what I call the 2 big M's, and that's the money and the markets. So we're getting a lot of interest from supply chains now in saying, well, how do we know that food that we're buying from various producers is regenerative, and the language is switching from sustainable to regenerative, and that's happening quite fast. In 3 weeks' time, I'll be showing around 9 visitors from one of the big burger chains in the US, looking in Australia at how do they buy regenerative food for their hamburgers. So that and that's coming from lots and lots of different supply chains. They're asking for, how do we know what we're buying, and how do we tell our consumers that it's actually been created in a regenerative way? And the other one is the money. The banks now, the Australian banking industry has actually set a target for banks to be requiring people they lend to be reporting on ESG in the 24 financial year. Now, I don't know whether that's the 23-24 financial year or the 24-25 financial year. I respect it's probably the latter. But already banks are asking the questions around what are you doing for your environment as a key part of doing either a bank review or a loan application. So that is changing, and so there's a lot of pressure starting to come, and it's showing up very quickly, and a lot of people are not sure what to do. My concern is that if, as rural industries, across the board in rural industries, if we don't actually get on the front foot with this, it's going to become a cost centre. Us working out what we've done and reporting on changes in our ecosystem health will become a cost centre. What we need to do, though, is get on the front foot, create standards, and then turn it into a profit centre, so that as we generate changes in natural capital, whether that be carbon or whether it be changes in other forms of natural capital, that there's an income source attached to that, so that the cost of measuring it and reporting it is offset, and hopefully more than offset by the value of those natural capital assets and the changes in them.
I think you're right, Terry. There's kind of been a sense, over probably the last decade, talking to different people in the sector, that we've got time, but globally, more and more, we're seeing that that the change seems to be well and truly stepping up. You've mentioned the banks, the money piece. We've also, talking to our members, seen significantly increased, I guess, interest and demand from particularly global customers. In demanding that, or at least beginning to ask that we are able to demonstrate in some way that we do have a sustainable supply chain. So you've just said that you're seeing it step up as well. What are your thoughts around, what the time frame is? We were sort of thinking, we had 5 years in excess, but it's now looking like, it's much sooner. It's much sooner.
Yes,
What would you say?
You don't have that much time. I think we had a guy speaking to us last year. We had a working with a supply chain, again, a global supply chain, looking at how do we, what is regenerative agriculture and how do we actually go about, getting access to this food. And there was a guy there from Credit Suisse who was the Australian manager of Credit Suisse, and he said, and this is just on a year ago now, he said that he thought that the financial institutions would be putting pressure on the ESG reporting within 5 years. And he said, but I expect it to come a lot faster than that. And he said that in their bank, for example, he thought that a year or 18 months before that, he gave us that talk, that he said that they thought that it'd be 5 years before they couldn't lend money to the coal industry. And he said, right now, within 18 months, we can't lend money to the coal industry. And he was absolutely right. The banks have started on this journey last year. And the interesting thing, I think, at the moment is that it's really banks, I think the money market and the supply chains are wanting to get this started, but I don't think there's any teeth in it right now. And one of the reasons for that is that I don't think they know what they actually want. They don't know what they want reported. But if they don't start this ball rolling, then none of us will ever work it out. So I think that, and again, that's where I think industry's got to get on the front foot. We've got to work out what can we report, what can we do that's not going to cost a fortune in terms of measurement, but is verifiable. In other words, it's that the changes that we're claiming are real. And I think that's probably the biggest shift that's occurred that I've seen in the last 18 months. I think it's an outcome of COVID, is that supply chains and other organisations now, and banks and financial institutions generally, are not going to take fluffy stuff as an answer anymore, and greenwashing is really out the door. Now, whatever we report now has to be real and has to be measured.
We hear these terms, Terry, verification, certification, and in different circles, I often hear that global supply chains are more interested in verification, not certification. Are you able to just step us through those two terms, what they mean and what you're hearing globally?
Yeah, so I think that if we take certification, so the organic system is a certifiable system. In other words, they're certifying that you're chemical free to the best of your ability to be chemical free. So they're certifying that there's a lot of stuff that you haven't done. But that's about the practice of producing something. The way this is heading, I believe, is heading towards outcome based. So it's not a matter of how you actually go about producing a change in your ecosystem. It's have you actually done a measurable shift in your ecosystem. And I think that's where it's headed. So what they're after is some way of verifying that there's been a change in that ecosystem. And it's not as though you've got to be at some end point. It's really, are we on a journey of improvement? And that's really what needs to be verified. And there's many ways that can be done. I think so with satellites these days, there's an awful amount you can learn about individual properties. So, and people are looking over your fence, all the time. So that's one way. But I think that there's some new technologies also that will help us really record what's going on and get that right without a lot of cost. That's the hope, anyway.
It's, the technical terms I think are confusing for a lot of people, Terry, particularly if people are new to the space. So what are you seeing in terms of not just your clients, I guess, but other farmers that you're interacting with, not only in Queensland but across Australia, in terms of those front runners? You talk about the sector really needing to get ready and position themselves to take these opportunities. So what are some of the things that you're seeing farmers do? And I guess that would lead us into a bit of a discussion around what you would like to see the Queensland agricultural sector start to do. We do seem very focused on carbon. Do we have carbon tunnel vision, and is that what we should be having, or are we actually missing some opportunities because we are so focused on carbon? Just interested to hear your thoughts. That's a bit of a big question, but I'll leave that with you.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely carbon tunnel vision, and probably carbon wasn't a bad place to start, and it's something that's gaining traction now. But I think that natural capital and the environment, biodiversity and other aspects of the environment are gaining traction very, very fast. And I think, again, I would say in the last 12 to 18 months, there's been quite a shift in requiring more than just carbon in terms of reporting. And so I think if we just stay carbon focused, it's dangerous. There's going to be a lot of unintended consequences come out of that. And, it's just singly focused. And to think that, this tiny little molecule in the atmosphere is actually an enemy when it's the basis of all food, that all of us and everything living thing on this planet essentially survives on, comes from that little bit of CO2 in the atmosphere. So I think that, and in terms of policy, what I believe is happening, I think, is a whole lot of idiocy happening at a policy level around the whole total focus on carbon, and we're going to be in all sorts of trouble, I think, in 10 or 15 years' time because of that. But I do believe that globally we're waking up to the fact that we need to be looking at a lot more than carbon. What can we do? I think there's a couple of things. There's social license as well, and I think that is starting to, that will also affect industry. I've just come back on the weekend from doing a program all of last week with the racehorse industry down in the Hunter Valley, and they're saying, well, we've actually got a bad image publicly, and we need to start doing stuff. So that they're interested in composting and using those waste products that are currently a problem to them and getting them back in paddocks and improving how they're managing horses. They're even now running livestock, cattle and so on in with horses to help improve the quality of the pastures and doing multi-species cover cropping into their paddocks, which will benefit the horses as well as benefit the ecosystem. So I think there's quite a lot of stuff we need to do, but really the focus is at the soil health end of it. And if we start to get that right, that will probably reduce a fair bit of chemical usage in the environment, whether that be fertilizers or other sorts of chemicals. So by getting the soil health right, we certainly reduce those things. That will head through into biodiversity, water quality. So all of those other things are just as important, if not more important, than carbon itself. So don't know whether I got to answer your question then.
I think you made a really good start, Terry. We've actually had a comment in the chat which segues into what we're talking about. And the comment is it not more about ESG than carbon alone? This is where all the major international companies are moving. So I think I do agree with that comment, and I guess our challenge is how do we maintain our holistic approach to all of this when there is a political focus on
You're muted, Joe. There you go. So
I'm unmuted now, so I'm not sure what you heard, if of any of that, but there is a comment in the chat which says, is it not more about ESG than carbon alone? That is where all the major international companies are moving, which supports where you are heading, Terry. But I guess the challenge is when we do have policies, not just in Australia, but I think globally, that are so focused on reducing emissions, how do we move forward, I guess, from an agricultural perspective, but also from a broader community perspective in making sure our focus is more holistic?
There's definitely a much bigger emphasis or a coming emphasis on ESG. And certainly all the big companies and the banks and the supply chains are very interested in the ESG component. But I think being able to measure and report on that is back where carbon was probably 5 to 8 years ago, in that the methods are still in the process of being developed. The regulation is not there. So if I look at Australia today in terms of carbon, we lead the world. We have legislation, we have regulation, we have a regulator, we have methodologies, and we have a market. And when I talk to people in other parts of the world, Australia is actually the envy of other parts of the world because that we actually have that system. So when I look at a lot of the natural capital stuff today, I think we're missing most of those elements right now. So if we're not careful, it'll be the Wild West. The pressure's coming on, but I think everyone that we've spoken to in the supply chains and in the financial institutions are pragmatic about this. They understand that there's a lot of stuff to put in place before this can become sort of more serious or more real. So I think it's got a way to go, but it's where we're headed.
And interesting to hear you say, Terry, you know, that we lead the world in this space. In your travels, do you think we're getting the global recognition for how well we are doing around the world? Are other countries looking to us for best practice? Are we getting that recognition globally, do you think?
I think we're starting to. I think we're getting more recognition from overseas as to how advanced Australia is than we get in Australia. You know, there's a lot of criticism of what we're doing internally without recognising that we are actually leaders in putting that whole thing together for carbon. Now we've got to do the same around ESG. So, and in some ways it's just as complicated. You know, so how do we report this? How do we turn an improvement in natural assets into a financial instrument or into an income source for farmers? And I think that there is some work going on in this space, but it's cutting edge and it's not there yet. But you know, there's a fair bit of movement. I think we'll get there, but I think we're 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years off yet.
And I think one of the challenges we have is how do we tell that story more effectively? We've been, you know, seeing some of our industries, the cotton industry, for instance, you know, has a wonderful story to tell around improved water efficiency, you know, reduced chemical use. And I think fair to say for most of our members industries, they all have a really good story to tell. But how we get that message out there, I think, not only within our sector, but to consumers and globally, is a key challenge for us. Just circling back to a question earlier, Terry, around the front runners in this space. You know, do you have a couple of examples you could share around farmers who are, you know, really leading the pack in terms of what they're doing on farm, and just a couple of examples you could share with us? I think now you're on mute, Terry. So I think it's okay.
I don't know what's going on there.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, yeah, so there are a few examples I take to start with. The group of producers that are now going to get carbon credits this year. So they've led the way. They were pioneers back in 2016 and prepared to get in and have a go. And as a result of that, they're actually going to get some quite decent sized checks this year in terms of being paid for ACCUs. I think there's some good examples in horticulture where people are doing some really good work around soil health and using composting and those sort of approaches to improve soil health. And as we improve soil health, we're going to improve nutrient density, which I think, again, in the medical industry and a whole lot of other areas, in terms of food production, is becoming an increasing concern for consumers, that the products we're producing don't actually have the nutrient density and the phytochemicals in them that maybe they had 50, 60, 100 years ago. I think in the cropping industries, there's people now in transition to more regenerative practices. So I think it's, the way I look at it is, it's a little bit like if we're wanting to move from, say, an industrial approach to agriculture to something more regenerative, we're facing this this valley of death in front of us, and how do we cross that? And a lot of people consider that it might be like you know, putting a tightrope across and waddling across this valley of death with the big crocodile underneath us and hoping we don't fall in. It's not as bad as that. And in fact, what we need to do is think about, well, if we've got a valley to cross, wouldn't we prefer to build a bridge? And before we could start building a bridge, we would need to build foundations. And to build those foundations, there are many things that we can do. And it all starts with our soil. So, you know, if we've got to continue to use weedicides, and in most crops we'll have to do that for quite some time. But we can put, you know, fulvic acid with glyphosate, for example, and reduce the volume. One of the most damaging things that we do in agriculture is overuse of nitrogen. And now there are people that have got right back to zero nitrogen and producing the same crops. And so that can be done. And also I think that even if you must use nitrogen or part of the transition, you can't go cold turkey on a lot of these things. So how do you slowly withdraw? It's a little bit like saying, well, we've got a soil system that feels like it's a bit on crack, or cocaine, and you can't just go cold turkey on that. You've actually got to, it'll go through withdrawal symptoms. And so we have to help it through those withdrawal. Adding the biology and stimulating biology is a good way to help us get through that withdrawal symptom. So really focusing on our soil and plant microbiomes and what are we doing to encourage those microbiomes. So I think across a lot of industries now, dairy industry as well, there's some good examples of people that have shifted away from very heavy nitrogen use. Animal health has got better, soil's got better, water use has gone down, everything that you would want to happen. So I think that we ought to be looking at all of this as an opportunity in agriculture, because it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to reduce costs. It's an opportunity for us to improve the quality of production. And it's an opportunity for us to potentially get paid for generating natural capital. And really, farmers are the only people in the world that can do this on scale. We must absolutely have the global farming community and grazing communities on board to make the changes that we need to make in this little old blue earth of ours.
I couldn't agree more. I think farmers are the key stakeholders. We manage a lot of land and we are good at it, Terry. As you've said before, we lead the world already in lots of on-farm best practice. So I couldn't agree more. So when we look to New Zealand and see that their setting of targets has been more around things like, getting everyone to have done their baselining, those types of targets. Where are we in terms of Queensland agriculture, and I guess more broadly in Australia, in terms of having that, baselining first step work done? Have we got a long way to go, or have we made a good start?
We've got a very long way to go. There's very little baselining done in terms of either ecology or carbon in the system. And one of the reasons for that is it's still very expensive to do, and people are still unsure of the results they're going to get from spending money in it. But I think that I'd rather be in Australia than New Zealand and most other countries in the world right now. And the reason for that is that our policy generally, in terms of carbon at least, has got us focused on sequestration rather than avoided emissions. So I look at an avoided emission as being a little like saying, well, we're driving towards a cliff. What we'll do is we'll start slowing down our emissions and we will just put that car in second gear and keep driving towards the cliff. Sequestration to me is what farmers can do, and that is putting carbon into soils and vegetation and pulling it out of the atmosphere. And I think the numbers that I've done based on data from NASA is that if we put around about 3 to 4 gigatons of carbon a year into soils or vegetation and stored it there permanently, we would start to reverse CO2 going into the atmosphere. And so I think that there's so much focus, and particularly overseas in New Zealand, they're so focused on avoiding emissions that they're not looking at the opportunity for sequestration. But at least in Australia, we have the policy for that, and we have the focus on sequestration first and emissions second. And the methodologies are being changed so that by maybe the end of this year, certainly into the end of next year, as we start in the farming systems, as we start to reduce emissions by reducing nitrogen, for example, or reducing methane, that we will start to earn credits by reducing emissions. Right now, with the exception of the cotton industry, and there's the scheme in the grazing industry as well, but pretty hard to get at, we're really not getting rewarded for reducing emissions in Australia, but that is coming.
I think that's often the question that's asked. I don't think there's many people who don't want us to be working towards, really healthy landscapes and improved environmental outcomes, but the question of who pays Whose responsibility is it? Who will pay? What are you seeing in terms of that space emerging now, Terry?
I think there's some real confusion, I think, between net zero and carbon neutral to start with. And I'll give you some numbers, real numbers of these properties that are going to sell carbon credits this year to put this in context. Their total emissions are averaging 8% of their sequestration over the last 5 years. So that puts emissions into context of sequestration. Now that's on grazing land, so they're reasonable sized properties. They're anything from 500 hectares up to 5,000 hectares. But the sequestration is a far greater story than emissions. Now for those people, they've got baseline emissions. So for them to be able to sell credits, and that some of them, their emissions have exceeded their baseline emissions. So the emissions that have exceeded baseline emissions will be taken off their sequestration, and they're at net zero. So they can actually sell their product, and that is net zero. For them to become carbon neutral, they would have to then take the baseline emissions and subtract that from their sequestration. And on the properties where I've got real data on productivity, etc., it's looking like the market would have to pay them anywhere between $1.70 and nearly $3 a kilo live weight more for their beef to overcome the opportunity cost of selling those credits as opposed to becoming carbon neutral. So I think the first target for all of us is actually to get to net zero, so that we're going back and reducing emissions and then staying at that reduced level and not going forward with emissions. But the opportunity in agriculture is sequestration as well. And so we need to, you really keep that in mind. So on some of these properties, if I take their annual sequestration, might be something like 18 to 20,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide. Their annual emissions are around 1,000 to 1,500 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So you can see that emissions are very low relative to the sequestration. And on those that, the ones who increased emissions, they increased by probably 500 tonnes of CO2 a year relative to an 18,000 tonne emission sequestration. So, I think we're lucky in Australia that the focus has been on sequestration. And, as I say, in future, we will start to be funded for reducing emissions as well.
There's a comment in the chat, Terry. We lead the world, but suffer market loss to countries like Brazil that cut valuable rainforest to plant sugar and raise cattle. The system is tilted towards the most cost efficient. We have high cost processing goods. How can we use regenerative ag to become more competitive when other countries don't conform to the same emission standards? Do you have some comments?
That's a really good question. And in talking to some of these supply chains around meat in particular, one of the tick boxes that you've actually got to tick that you haven't cleared land in order to produce that beef. So I would think that, once this stuff actually starts to become more real and more serious, and that might be another 5 years, then it will be harder for Brazil to sell their beef than it will be in Australia, or they'll be heavily discounted for beef that's produced off land where they've more recently cleared timber. In our situation, a lot of our timber was cleared a long time ago, and a lot of producers are allowing some of that to come back. And there's also credits in allowing some of that to come back. So I think it's a good question. Right now, I'd rather be selling Aussie beef than Brazilian beef with the outbreak of foot and mouth in Brazil, because it certainly has affected their ability to sell right now. And the other thing that affects Brazil versus Australia as well is actually the relativity of the real to the US dollar and the Aussie dollar to the US dollar. And one of the things that's actually made Brazil more competitive is the reduction in the value of the real. So I think, there's not just there in the rainforest, but there's a few other things that's affecting their competitiveness. But we've got to stay competitive, and that's why if we can get paid for these ecosystem services, then that allows us to be more competitive.
And Terry, the premise of our discussion is, around achieving environmental outcomes, but also maintaining or increasing productivity, because, as a major food producer, it's obviously really important to Australians, but also to people who we export food to as well, that we're able to maintain production. There is a comment in the chat asking your opinion on locked up mature mulga lands, and having mature mulga locked up seems to counter the science and offers questionable benefits. So that kind of segues into how we'd like to sum up today, and just hearing your thoughts around, I guess locking areas of landscapes up in trying to achieve environmental outcomes versus, working with farmers and achieving productivity outcomes through soil health and other environmental processes or best practice, I guess, use. So just your general thinking around not just in relation to the mulga lands, but that broader topic.
Absolutely agree. Actually, I don't think that shutting up landscape is a good thing. I think landscape in agriculture needs to be managed so that it is productive and the ecosystem is moving forward. Locking it up tends to send it the other way, including in national parks. And I think that the mulga, I think, there's probably a bit of a misconception there. The mulga that's where they're getting carbon credits is actually young mulga that's regrowing. You can't get carbon credits by locking up old mulga. So I think that letting the younger mulga regrow, there's pluses and minuses for that. But what I have seen on the properties where we have clients that are doing that is that they're actually using the income from those carbon credits to develop the better parts of their properties. So they're fencing and watering and managing the better part of their properties better, and including exclusion fencing. So I think that, there's some pluses and minuses in that, but generally I don't like to see country locked up and not used. I think we're in the food production business in agriculture, and food and fibre, and I think that that's the business we need to stay in, and we just need to do that well enough. So there, that's where I think that the focus on natural capital or ecosystem services is less damaging than that one-eyed focus on carbon. So it's that, that's the thing that can get us into trouble. If we just lock country up and let trees grow, I think that's totally counterproductive. And really the impact that's going to have on the ecosystem with the amount of trees that we can lock up and let grow is infinitesimal compared to the job ahead of us.
We're going to run out of time, Terry, which I knew was inevitable. We could continue this chat for some time. So if anyone who's listening does have one or two more burning questions, please put them in the chat and we'll ask them of Terry before we wrap up. But Terry, your advice to a farmer who is starting to really turn their thoughts to how they can participate in this space, and for position their business and also, achieve the environmental outcomes that they're hoping to achieve. What would your advice be, I guess, and how can RCS help?
Well, I think the answer, as I think it was the old Goon show used to say, I think the answer lies in the soil, and it comes back to what can we do to improve soils while we're producing what we produce. And there's many ways of doing that, and many pathways to that transition from where we are to maybe where we want to be. And So the first step, I think, is actually learning more about soil health and regeneration generally. And I think that that's probably the starting point. I think in terms of a lot of smaller properties in horticulture and in sugar, the carbon projects are probably not really going to be a thing. I think that they're too expensive for small scale. Even on large scale in horticulture and sugar, where the gross margins per hectare are very large, and the margin per hectare from carbon is relatively small, the constraints around doing a carbon project in those industries might be worse than the impact of, probably not worth it economically. It may not be, but adding carbon to your soil, whether you're doing a carbon project or not, is actually a critical part of soil health. So I look at our system as a little bit like a pie, and over the last 8,000 years or so of agriculture, we've been shrinking the size of this pie. And at the centre of that pie is carbon. We've got ecosystem services as a part of that pie. We've got the water cycle, how well we utilise water. Energy flow, which is how well we utilise sunlight. And soil health and biodiversity as parts of that pie. So if we've been shrinking that through lack of knowledge, etc., for the last 8,000 years, it's not a big ask, I don't think, now with what we know now about soils and management to actually reverse that and start to grow the size of that ecological pie. And many of the bits of that ecological pie are freebies. Now, if you look at, rainfall's free, ecosystem services, improvement of that, the jobs they do for us is free. The CO2 in the atmosphere is free, which is a major plant food. And the sunlight's free. So a lot of our raw materials in agriculture are actually free. And so what I think we need to do is focus on how do we make more use of the things that we get for nothing and focus on them, because often we don't value enough the things that we get for nothing.
In the chat, circularity, waste is still a big issue. How do we simplify our supply chains and use waste reduction to maximise profits and sustainability? That's a good question, Terry. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely agree. If we can be circulating waste back into agriculture, whether that's, and the main tool for that is composting, which is a very, very old tool. And it's also a great way to be improving soil health. So yeah, I totally agree. We need to be reducing waste of water is another big one. Reducing waste in transport, reducing waste in products that are thrown out or buried. I think that absolutely we've got to be looking at waste and circulating as much back into the system as we can. And I think circulatory economic systems are where we've got to go to, without a doubt. And so, sorry, you just asked before about what RCS can do on some of this stuff. We do run programs on transition in agriculture that we can help with carbon projects, and hopefully as we progress with some of the stuff we're working on, we'll be able to help with natural capital and reporting.
Thanks, Terry. And I can say over the years personally, the friends and colleagues I've had who have been through one of your courses have, consistently told me that it's been personally transformative for them, but also for their business. So I, certainly can endorse the experiences of people that I've known in making the effort to actually educate themselves through the resources that RCS provides. So is that information, Terry, is all on your website if people are interested in having a look at what's available?
Yes, thank you, Joe. That's just rcsaustralia.com.au.
That's great. Thanks, Terry. We are going to wrap it up. You have given us a few calls to action today. You've talked about the Valley of Death, and we're well and truly hoping to build a bridge so that we don't fall in to the crocodile. You've talked about cliffs, approaching cliffs, and how we might be able to avoid having to go off that cliff. You've also talked about going cold turkey and withdrawals and cracks. So certainly some key terms in there which is spurring us all onto action. But more seriously, I think, the sector can see that, time is now of the essence. Certainly from my perspective and from QFF's perspective, we would really like to be able to support agriculture to define their own future in this space. They are the key stakeholder at the table, and they are expert land managers. So we're certainly keen to continue to support along the journey, and it is a learning journey for all of us to help agriculture and farmers and regional communities really take this opportunity, navigate the challenges so that we can forge, a meaningful future and continue to grow the world's best food, fibre and foliage. And build stronger regional communities in the process. So we are on a journey, but we really appreciate your time this morning, Terry. We will be hearing more from you as our partnership continues. But a big thank you from myself, the team at QFF and everyone online for your time today.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for your attention and your time and some really good questions.
Some great questions. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll wrap it up and look forward to chatting to you again on future webinars. Thanks for joining.